Mr. Speaker, the Investing for the People Act is a 2-year budget bill that will raise the sequestration caps for defense and non-defense discretionary spending for fiscal year 2020 and 2021. I believe my colleagues from both sides of the aisle fully understand the devastating effects of sequestration. Across the board, mandatory cuts to every federal program is not a successful path to fiscal responsibility. Without taking action to lift the caps established by the Budget Control Act, non-defense discretionary funding will be cut by $54 billion. Such drastic cuts threaten public health, the environment, access to education, job training, and life-saving social services like food and housing assistance. Cuts to non-defense discretionary funding would also impact our national security. Nearly 1/3 of investments in this area funds veterans programs, homeland security initiatives, diplomatic operations, foreign aid, and Justice Department activities. If an agreement on lifting the cap is not reached, defense programs also stand to lose $71 billion. In a dangerous world, those cuts would be, in my view, harmful to national and global security. Only a few months ago, the American people felt the harsh effects of a government shutdown. It is time to come together to take decisive action to avoid another blow to essential federal programs that help hardworking Americans in every state. This legislation ensures working families will be able to rely on continued federal funding for the programs that keep them safe, support their jobs, and invest in their children. In fiscal year 2020, defense spending would be capped at $664 billion, with non-defense discretionary spending capped at $631 billion. The Investing for the People Act would also provide for up to $8 billion annually for non-defense overseas contingency operations, OCO activities, that do not count against the spending caps, while limiting OCO designation of defense spending in 2020 and 2021 to no more than the fiscal year 2019 level of $69 billion. In his budget, President Trump proposed continuing spending on defense measures, but massive cuts to domestic programs like public health research, infrastructure investment, and support for low-income families. Even as our nation draws down from our overseas war operations, domestic spending remains at a historic low as percentage of our economy. H.R. 2021 provides a pathway for improving the lives of Americans in every community and renews our commitment to spending to meet the needs of our communities and invest in our economy. In addition to protecting Americans from spending cuts, the House will be considering protections for a product all of us here today rely on to do our jobs and live our lives, just like millions of Americans, the Internet. This rule also provides for consideration of essential protections for American consumers who use the Internet. The Save the Internet Act would reinstate the Open Internet Order of 2015 that classifies broadband Internet services as common carriers that are prohibited from preferentially treating or discriminating against groups of persons. An overwhelming 86% of Americans oppose the FCC's rollback of net neutrality protections. All this legislation does, Mr. Speaker, is restore those protections. Fair and reliable Internet access is absolutely essential to millions of working families and small business owners. Practices like blocking, throttling, and paid prioritization harm the ability of every American to experience the Internet in the same way, regardless of provider or how much money you pay. The Save the Internet Act includes enhanced transparency protections and enacts specific rules against throttling, blocking, or other violations of net neutrality. The FCC would be empowered to investigate consumer and business complaints and impose necessary fines against Internet service providers for violations of the Communications Act. The bill also revives pathways to Internet access for every American, especially those in rural communities who are left behind by modern high-speed Internet infrastructure. Save the Internet Act would once again allow the FCC to fund rural broadband through the Connect America Fund. Additionally, this legislation revives the Lifeline program created under the Reagan administration to subsidize phone service for low-income families. Under this legislation, the FCC would again have authorization to use the Lifeline program to expand access to broadband for low-income Americans, especially seniors, students, veterans, and disabled Americans. In response to concerns raised by our Republican colleagues, the Save the Internet Act also ensures that the FCC has the power to protect access to the Internet, but does not have authority to make decisions over Internet content or the power to impose taxes and fees for Internet access. This legislation forbears the FCC from applying more than 700 regulations under the Communications Act that are unnecessary to protecting an open Internet, such as rate setting. Internet service providers have long claimed that they were hamstrung by net neutrality protections and that strong consumer protections were preventing them from investing in higher speeds and advanced broadband infrastructure. In reality, ISPs actually increased speeds and invested huge amounts in improving their broadband during the time when net neutrality protections were enforced by the FCC. Moreover, many of the largest providers have failed to keep their promise of increased investing after the Trump FCC repealed those protections, with investments actually shrinking in recent years. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to vote for this rule and for both pieces of legislation underlying it, and I reserve the balance of my time.